It's late summer, 1944. The house is quiet, except for the hum of a refrigerator and the faint whisper of the fan in the bedroom window. A woman, she's a housewife, likely in her 30s, wakes with a start. She's not fully awake. The world is thin at the edges, like a photograph in sunlight. She smells something, sweet and cloying, something that shouldn't belong inside a bedroom on a Midwestern night. She sits up. Her arms feel heavy. Her mouth tingles. She tries to call out. Her voice won't come. She reaches for the lamp switch, and her hand goes numb. Panic threads through her like a sharp cord. She thinks, gas, an intruder, help. She can't move. This is still unanswered, and tonight, we walk through the slow, strange story of the mad gasser of Mattoon. Hi, I'm Lena Corvett. If you've listened before, you know the pattern. Start close, sit with the people, and try to hold a story up to simple questions. What happened? Who said it? What evidence is here? And what was going on around it? With this one, the answers are thin, and the fear is thick. I'm joined by Dr. Marcus Ellery. Marcus, welcome back.
Thanks, Lena. It's good to be here. I can already tell this one's going to be one of those cases that feels less like a closed file and more like an echo in a long hallway.
Yeah, it does. Before we get too far, just to set expectations for listeners, tonight we'll move from a single night, the kind of scene I just described, out into the town. The newspapers, the policemen, and the many people who said they were affected. We'll look at what symptoms were reported, what kinds of chemicals might cause them, and how social forces made Mattoon especially vulnerable to a scare. We'll try to keep to the record as much as we can and to mark clearly where the record stops. Ready?
Ready.
Segment 1, Gas in the Night. I want to stay with that moment for a little while. People who later recounted these attacks described waking from sleep, smelling something sweet. Some said like a new-mown hay or like fruit. Others said it was sickly sweet, almost floral. The sensation was often described as numbness around the mouth and face, a weakness in the limbs, sometimes an inability to speak. In some accounts, folks crawled to a window and saw a shadow or the outline of someone outside. In others, no one else in the house seemed affected. The panic is immediate. Neighbors were called, police were summoned. But, and this is important, when officers entered the house, there was rarely any physical trace. No broken glass, no spray cans, no chemical residue that was ever conclusively documented. Marcus, as a historian of panic, how do you hear that opening scene?
I hear fear and vulnerability, Lena. Waking up at night is one of the rawest human conditions. You're partially conscious, information processing is halting, and your body misreads signals. Add to that wartime anxiety. People had been told to look out for all sorts of threats, including chemical attacks. So the olfactory system, your nose, is a big amplifier. Smells are strongly tied to emotion and memory, and a faint odor can be interpreted as a deliberate assault. But that doesn't mean the people experiencing it were making it up in some malicious sense. What they experienced was real to them. The tricky part is whether the cause was a discrete external agent, someone dispersing an intoxicant, or whether the cause was social and physiological.
Right. And in Mattoon, in 1944, the background matters a lot. Segment 2, Wartime Mattoon. It's a small Illinois town on the home front. Men are overseas. There's rationing, sugar, meat, gasoline. The local paper runs war news, often with vivid imagery. There are leaflets and government warnings about chemical warfare. Gas masks and the horrors of mustard gas have been burned into the public consciousness by newsreels and civilian training exercises. Factories in the region work on war contracts, so people are used to industrial smells and chemicals. but they're also nervous about anything unfamiliar. That combination, daily exposure plus the persistent fear of enemy attacks, makes the town a tinderbox for suspicion. Marcus, you wrote about how communities at the time read the world through a wartime lens. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. During the war, the American home front was saturated with images and messages about threats. Propaganda intentionally heightened vigilance, often for legitimate reasons like scrap drives and blackouts, but it also taught people that unseen threats could be deadly. The specter of gas warfare, especially after the European theater's trench poisonings during World War I, lingered. Even if people had little technical knowledge about what an actual gas attack would require, the idea that an invisible enemy could enter the home was powerful. So in Mattoon, everyday oddities, a faint smell from a radiator, a neighbor spraying insecticide, or a leaking can of paint, was easily read as an attack. That doesn't explain every report, but it sets the stage.
And it is worth noting the timing. Late summer and early fall, when windows are open, when people are sleeping lightly because of humidity and worry, when insects and strange odors are more common. Okay, segment 3. The first reported attacks. The household often cited early in the records is the Kearney household. In their account, members of the family woke to a smell, experienced numbness and a temporary paralysis, and reported a shadowy figure outside. Neighbors and police were called. Other early incidents that historians have dug up show similar narratives: strange odors, physical symptoms that are temporary, and sometimes someone peering in from a window or running away. But here is where the story gets complicated. Different witnesses gave different times, different descriptions of the smell, and different sequences of events. Marcus, in cases you've studied, how common is that kind of divergence in early reports?
Very common. Human memory is reconstructive. When someone is asked after a frightening event, they piece together a story from fragments and cues. If newspapers publish a particular detail, say sweet, sickly odor, that becomes part of the public script. Then, unsurprisingly, later witnesses will incorporate that language when they describe their own experience, even if the original sensation was subtly different. That doesn't mean the original was false. It just means memory and storytelling are social processes. We also can't forget that early reports create a template. Once one household says someone looked in the window, others are more likely to say the same.
Segment 4, a town on edge, the wave of sightings. After those first incidents, reports multiplied. Over a few days and weeks, Mattoon citizens reported multiple attacks across neighborhoods. Common elements emerged. The scent, variously described as sickly sweet, new-mown hay, grape Kool-Aid, tingling or numbness around the lips, temporary weakness or paralysis. Several witnesses said they saw a dark figure outside their windows. Some people claimed to find a rag or a sprayer. Others swore they saw footprints. The newspapers, to their credit, covered the story with urgency. The problem is that press coverage acts like fuel. Paper after paper runs similar accounts, and the narrative coalesces into a single scary idea: a serial attacker moving through town at night, gassing households. Marcus, how does press coverage influence the spread of these reports?
Massively. The press serves as both mirror and amplifier, reflecting the story back to the community and making it larger. When the press uses vivid language, Mad Gasser is a great example of a label that sticks. It creates a shared frame. Then people interpret ambiguous experiences through that frame. There's also the issue of availability. If each paper runs the story on the front page, citizens are constantly reminded that this is happening, causing heightened vigilance and sensitivity to normal stimuli. Suddenly, every odd smell becomes potentially threatening. The coverage also often included calls for police action, which led to patrols and armed citizens. That, in turn, reinforced the reality of the threat. People see armed neighbors and think, this must be dangerous. And the cycle continues.
And Mattoon did respond. Segment 5. Police, press, and public panic. Police increased patrols. Officers staked out neighborhoods, and at times, local men posted with shotguns outside their houses. Newspaper headlines were dramatic. Some used words like terror and assailant, and that language mattered. But the police also noticed inconsistencies. Officers reported finding little physical evidence, often nothing at all. Some local medical professionals said they couldn't reconcile the symptoms with a known chemical agent. Over time, some officials started to express skepticism publicly, which helps explain why the wave tapered off almost as quickly as it began. Marcus, when the authorities push back like that, does that usually calm people or make them angrier?
It depends on local trust and the context. If people trust the police and media, a calm, skeptical official statement can deflate panic. If they don't, it can deepen suspicion. The authorities are covering it up. In Mattoon, there was a mix. Some residents embraced the skepticism, especially once initial reports failed to produce clear evidence. But others dug in. What's interesting is that once the papers ran more measured accounts and the sustained drama in the headlines faded, new reports decreased. That suggests part of the wave was socially sustained.
Segment 6. Inside the house, symptoms and science. Let's get into the signs people reported. Numbness around the mouth, breathing difficulties, nausea, dizziness, feelings of paralysis, often brief, distracting, and frightening. Medical attempts to match those symptoms later suggested possibilities. Chloroform or ether could cause temporary unconsciousness. Certain anesthetics might cause numbness. Industrial solvents could produce dizziness and nausea. But here's the problem. Many of these agents require concentrations or delivery methods that seem unlikely for someone walking around a nighttime neighborhood. To knock a person down from outside, you'd need a fairly dense cloud, a close delivery method, or prolonged exposure. You'd expect either more severe outcomes or more physical traces. A spray device, a chemical smell strong enough to be detected by officers, or fatalities. In Mattoon, there were very few fatalities tied to these reports. Marcus, medically speaking, does the pattern fit a real chemical attack?
Medically, it's complicated. The symptoms, as described, are consistent with low-level exposure to various volatile substances, solvents, anesthetics, certain inhalants. But those exposures are usually accidental, linked to spills, confined spaces, or direct administering. A covert, outdoor dispersal that produced mild, transient symptoms without leaving residue or causing fatalities is less plausible. Also, recall that many early accounts describe only one person in a house being affected, while others slept soundly. That selective impact would be strange if a gas had filled a room. People in different sleeping positions or with different sensitivities could have different reactions, but it's another factor that pushes us to question a singular chemical explanation.
So there's an important tension. The symptoms fit a range of possible chemical causes on the surface, but the logistics and the pattern of the reports make a straightforward toxic explanation awkward. That brings us, gently, to the human side. Segment 7. Fear, suggestion, and rumor. We need to be careful. This isn't about dismissing people who were terrified. Instead, it's an attempt to see how social processes might produce real physical symptoms without a malicious actor behind every door. Mass suggestion, sometimes labeled mass psychogenic illness, happens when communities under stress begin to experience shared symptoms. It often starts with a credible index case, a story that grabs attention, and is then shaped by expectations. People wake up, they smell something faint, they think gas, and their bodies respond with dizziness or numbness because the mind and body are tightly connected. Marcus, you've written about nighttime suggestibility. How does being half awake change reporting?
Being half awake changes everything. In that state, the brain's predictive processing is dominant. It fills in sensory gaps with expectations. If you expect an odor and you detect a vague scent, the brain amplifies that into a clear perception. Emotional arousal, fear, triggers physiological changes like shallow breathing and a surge of adrenaline, which can cause tingling, lightheadedness, and perceived paralysis or immobility. Once one person in a town publicly says these things happened and a paper prints it, others notice the pattern and then reinterpret their own ambiguous experiences to fit that pattern. That's the social contagion element. Again, this is not fake. It's a real phenomenon where perception and physiology interact.
There are several details that make this particularly believable in Mattoon. In many accounts, only a single household member experienced symptoms. In others, people improved after talking to neighbors or after a bit of rest. Some details changed over retellings. The sense description shifts, the timing slides, a shadow becomes a cap, then becomes a figure. A couple of specific cases are harder to wave away. Accounts where multiple household members were affected simultaneously, or where someone chased a figure and claimed to have been sprayed. Those reports, if verified, are harder to tile into a purely psychogenic pattern. Which brings us to our next segment, suspects. Segment 8, the prime suspects, gasser, hoaxer, or no one at all.
We should treat each idea fairly. First, a real attacker. If someone had been moving through neighborhoods spraying or releasing a chemical, they'd need access to a chemical agent, a delivery mechanism, and likely some knowledge of its effects. They'd also need the nerve to operate in a crowded town during wartime. Motive is a big open question. People have speculated everything from a deranged thrill seeker to a revengeful neighbor. The weaknesses in that theory are significant. There's no confirmed device ever recovered, no clear suspect who had the means, and no one definitively caught. The logistics of delivering a non-lethal but incapacitating dose outdoors in a typical Midwestern home are difficult.
Second theory, a prankster, or a series of hoaxes. That fits some of the evidence. Rags left near windows, prepared bottles or sprayers found in a handful of cases, or people knocking to frighten others. A few hoaxes could seed a wider panic, but it's not a tidy fit for the earliest reports, where victims seem quite sincere, and where, again, there is sometimes more than one person in a house reporting symptoms. It's also hard to imagine pranksters continuing for weeks without being identified in a town where neighbors know each other. The third idea is mass hysteria, or, as you prefer, mass psychogenic illness. It accounts for the clustering, the mild, transient symptoms, and the long list of inconsistent details. But it struggles with those early, more concrete-seeming reports. Each theory has explanatory strengths and gaps.
Exactly. And here's where historical nuance matters. We don't have a complete archive. Some police reports were lost, some first-hand witnesses are long gone, and memories have been reshaped by decades of retelling. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither is it evidence of a coordinated chemical attack. My own read is that the most parsimonious explanation is a mix. A few genuine incidents, perhaps one or two people exposed to solvents or anesthetics in a way that produced real symptoms, combined with hoaxes and extraordinary social amplification. The result looks like a serial assailant because people have a cognitive bias toward pattern recognition, especially in scary domains.
Segment 9. The official line. Police in Mattoon did eventually push back. After a flurry of dramatic coverage, officers started to say publicly that many reports were probably caused by anxiety, ordinary household odors, or misperception. Local physicians expressed doubt about there being a gas circulating in the town. Those skeptical takes were printed along with, and sometimes beneath, the more sensational stories. And then, significantly, reports dropped off. The moral is not that authorities were right and the townspeople were wrong. It's that once a sober institutional narrative, however imperfect, entered public discourse, the social momentum of the scare stopped feeding itself.
Right. Panic needs a sustaining feedback loop. In Mattoon, once the feedback loop was interrupted, by skeptical reporting, by police presence, by ordinary life reasserting itself, the phenomenon decelerated. Another reason is that once enough attention has been paid and patrols increased, any actual prankster finds the heat too high to continue. If a real incident had been taking place, one might expect it to either escalate or be detected. Neither happened in an obvious, sustained way.
Segment 10. Origins of a legend. Why did this become the Mad Gasser of Mattoon and not some forgotten local blip? A few reasons. The evocative name, Mad Gasser, stuck. It has a shorthand horror to it. There were similar gasser scares in other American towns earlier in the 20th century. The template was available. Later writers, true crime collectors, and paranormal enthusiasts found the story compelling because it sits exactly at the intersection of fear, the unknown, and the unresolved. Each retelling invites embellishment, a more shadowy figure, a more dramatic paralysis, a sinister motive. Over the decades, the story accreted. It became folklore as much as report.
And folklore prefers simplicity. A single villain is easier to narrate than a patchwork explanation involving social contagion, a few accidents, and a river of anxiety. It's also worth noting that people love unsolved mysteries, particularly ones that feel domestic. Threats in your bedroom are more terrifying than threats in a distant city. So the Mad Gasser is compelling story material. Also, Mattoon is in the public record. Papers were archived, a few writers took interest, so it's easier for that story to persist than many other local scares that had less documentation.
Segment 11. Still unanswered. What we can and can't know. Let's enumerate. On the side that points to a real attacker, we have multiple independent accounts of odors and symptoms. A few witnesses reported seeing someone outside. There are claims of rags and sprayers in proximity to windows in isolated instances, and a few households reported multiple members affected at the same time. Those are pieces that lean toward an external agent. On the other side, we have no confirmed physical device recovered that could deliver the effects reported. We have inconsistent details and shifting descriptions. Many accounts describe only a single person affected in a household. Medical explanations for inhaled agents don't match the pattern cleanly, and the broader social context of wartime anxiety is a powerful amplifier. Marcus, if you had to summarize the strongest evidence for each side, concise, what would you say?
For a real attacker, multiple contemporaneous reports with similar symptom clusters, occasional sightings of a figure, and a few physical traces reported by witnesses. For non-physical explanations, the lack of definitive forensic evidence, the mismatch between expected outcomes of a gas attack and what was reported, the rapid tapering of incidents once media coverage cooled, and the fit of the pattern with known phenomena of mass suggestion. The short version? Both sides have plausible claims, and both are handicapped by gaps in the record.
Exactly. And because of those gaps, it's tough, maybe impossible, to verdict this with certainty. We can't bring in modern forensic science to test residues because there are no preserved residues to test. We can't reliably interview all original witnesses with the same immediacy. The case sits in that middle zone: plausible real incidents, plausible social explanation, and no silver bullet evidence either way. So we circle, we argue, we tell stories, and the story remains, as it has been, unresolved.
One other thing to hold on to. Unresolved doesn't mean unknowable in principle forever. New archival discoveries sometimes appear. Lost police memos, letters in a family chest, an old diary entry. But the further we move from the event, the fewer such discoveries remain likely. What remains are patterns and interpretations, which is what historians and psychologists can work with.
Segment 12. Listener reflection and closing. Before we close, I want to tell you a short, quiet anecdote that always stays with me. Several decades after the Mattoon scare, a woman who'd been a teenager in town wrote a letter to a local historian. She described how the entire neighborhood, for a week, slept differently. Some with lights on, some with doors unlocked, some with one parent stationed by a window. She wrote not to claim she was attacked, but to reflect on how the experience shifted the town's sense of safety. She signed, "We learned how quickly fear can move from one house to the next." That, to me, is part of the story: how communities remember and how a brief scare can shape behaviors long after the newspapers stop printing the headline. That, to me, is part of the story: how communities remember and how a brief scare can shape behaviors long after the newspapers stop printing the headline. So here's what we leave you with. The Mad Gasser of Mattoon is an American mystery that resists tidy answers. The evidence for a real malicious actor is suggestive in places and thin in others. The evidence for a socially driven panic explains a lot, but doesn't eliminate the possibility of isolated real incidents. Choosing between those explanations requires weighing the plausibility of a covert nighttime gas attack against the demonstrated power of suggestion under stress. Which feels more likely to you? Which explanation would you need more evidence for to be convinced otherwise? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Marcus, any final thoughts before we sign off?
Just one. There's a human dignity element we should never forget. Whether a household's suffering came from an external attacker or from an internal psychological process, the distress was real. People were frightened and felt violated. That matters. And it's worth being humble about the limits of our historical knowledge. These stories offer a mirror. They show how fear operates, how communities respond, and how narratives, true, partially true, or false, shape lives.
Thank you, Marcus. If you want to read more about the case, I recommend digging into contemporaneous local paper archives and archived police radio logs when available. Primary sources give you the texture of the moment. We also have source notes and a short bibliography on the episode page for anyone who wants to dig deeper.
And Lena, one last, smaller point. When you encounter modern scares, viral rumors on social media, sudden clusters of health concerns, there's often a similar interior logic. The past isn't identical to the present, but the human responses are consistent. Uncertainty plus perceived threat equals a heightened readiness to believe. That's not a moral failing, it's a survival instinct.
Absolutely. To our listeners, thank you for spending this time with us. If you have family stories, local legends, or archives about the Mad Gasser of Mattoon or similar events in your hometown, we are always interested. You can reach us at the show's email. Tell us what sources you know about, or if someone in your family lived through an episode like Mattoon, let us know. Sometimes those personal traces are the most illuminating parts of a puzzle. This is still unanswered, where some mysteries hang, not because we can't explain them, but because we're never completely sure that we have. I'm Lena Corbett. Good night.
Good night.